today for this public event, Bringing the Back End to the Forefront, Looking Ahead to the Future Nuclear Fleet. It's also a pleasure to introduce Rowan Price, Research Assistant for the Nuclear Safeguards Program and the Proliferation, Rowan, sorry, I'm already messing it up. Proliferation Prevention Program. Nope.
Partnerships and Proliferation Prevention Program.
Thank you. And as of course, Rowan is the author of the paper that we are here to discuss today. Her working paper is a first of its kind, studying emerging reactors and spent fuel management, and particularly focusing on how challenges in final disposal, fuel reprocessing and recycling, and the implementation of international safeguards approaches and how they should be considered from the design stage. Her paper investigates, or really is lying at that intersection between nuclear waste management and non-proliferation. And it's part of a wider project called Back End to the Future, which is funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and looking at how nuclear waste management is done globally. And the Nuclear Safeguards Program also looks at evolving safeguards obligations and emerging technologies and how this has an impact on states and industry as we go forward. Her paper comes at a time when momentum is gaining across the globe, whether it be in China, the United States, and Canada and Europe, on the next generation of nuclear power reactors. And these reactors will introduce new fuel forms, including liquid and metal forms, pebble beds. And these reactor designs will reconceptualize current approaches to nuclear power and will add another layer of complexity to spent fuel management. It's also a pleasure to introduce our two discussants, Andy Worrell and Jim Casterton. Andy is Deputy Director for Gateway for Accelerated Innovation, or GAIN, and is also section head at Oak Ridge National Laboratory and UK country coordinator for DOE Office of Nuclear Energy. And a fun fact about Andy is that he did a school trip way back when, Andy, just a couple of years ago, to India and met Indira Gandhi. Jim Casterton is Stimson's very own non-resident fellow for the Safeguards Program. Jim has more than 35 years of experience in nuclear non-proliferation, chairing technical discussions related to export controls, and also a number of different positions within the IAEA and also Canada's Nuclear Safety Commission. And a fun fact about Jim is that he has participated in every single NPT RevCon since 1985. So with that, I will turn it over to Rowan, but just first a note to our attendees that you can change the configuration of how you're viewing the panelists. You can put us in a grid or in a stage view if you go up, and you can click the layout button in the top right. Also a note for participants to be able to use the chat for questions after Rowan has given her presentation, and Andy, and then Jim will provide their comments, and put your questions into the Q&A function. There is no chat function. So with that, I will turn it over to Rowan to present her paper.
My name is Rowan Price, and today I'll be talking about my research into spent fuel management and safeguards considerations for emerging reactors. Nuclear power has remained largely unchanged since its inception. Now, an emerging generation of innovative power reactors proposes to provide safer, cheaper energy through the use of a host of new fuels, coolants, and operating techniques. My research assessed some of the challenges that these reactors pose in spent fuel management and back-end safeguards due to their distinct features. My research also promotes the discussion and consideration of these challenges as fundamental parts of these reactors' development. Since these reactors will disrupt all stages of the fuel cycle, a discussion of one of the most contentious issues, spent nuclear fuel, is important. So first, let me talk about what we mean when we say the back end. So here's the nuclear fuel cycle. and it includes all stages needed for nuclear power operation, from uranium mining through spent fuel storage and disposal. In a once-through or open fuel cycle, after fuel is used in a reactor, it is removed, put in storage, and then eventually headed to disposal, where it will radioactively decay for hundreds of thousands of years. In a closed or twice-through cycle, fuel is removed from the reactor, reprocessed to extract uranium or plutonium, and then that uranium or plutonium is remade into recycled fuel. And you can see that with the green and yellow arrows here. And today we're going to be focusing on all of the stages after fuel is removed from a reactor. So whether that be reprocessing or disposal. That brings us to the current fleet. There are currently around 440 operational power reactors around the world, and 85% of those are light water reactors, which can be further broken down into pressurized water reactors and boiling water reactors. And these use a light water coolant around solid uranium fuel rods. Making up the majority of the remaining 15% are pressurized heavy water reactors, known as CANDU. And instead of light water, these use a deuterium oxide or heavy water coolant. There are, of course, a number of other reactors currently or that have historically operated, such as this fast breeder reactor shown here. But overall, light water reactors and CANDU have provided the experience base for spent fuel management and safeguards over the past 50 or 60 years. That brings us to the emerging fleet. So emerging reactors, which I use to refer here to the 6 technologies identified by the Generation 4 International Forum as being the most promising for future development, along with their derivatives, use a whole new host of fuels, coolants, and operating techniques that make them very different from existing conventional reactors. For example, the very high temperature reactor and the fluoride-cooled high temperature reactor can both use TRISO fuel, which consists of tiny particles of uranium fuel embedded in a larger prismatic block or in hundreds of thousands of spherical pebbles. Even further afield from the classic solid fuel rod is the fuel of the molten salt reactor, which isn't solid at all. Instead, fuel consists of a fuel coolant mix with particles dissolved into a molten salt. These reactors may also use a gas, metal, salt, or supercritical water coolant, which pose a number of operability advantages, but also pose challenges for fuel handling and treatment. I won't get too much into the core specifications here, as they are covered in more depth in the paper. But I do want to note that 3 of the 6 Generation 4 or emerging technologies are explicitly fast reactors, while 2 others can be either thermal, like the majority of operational reactors, or fast. And fast reactors have the capability to more easily be configured as breeder reactors, meaning they produce or breed more fissile material than they burn. And this is a controversial option, as it can more effectively use uranium resources, but has the potential to pose a major proliferation risk, as it can produce more material that is attractive for diversion or theft. In addition, as I previously mentioned with our chart, closed fuel cycles are an option for some emerging reactor designs as well, where they would recycle existing spent fuel and use it as fuel. Currently, there are around 440,000 metric tons of heavy metal of spent fuel in storage around the world. And this is resulting from operational and decommissioned power and research reactors. Since the 1970s, research around the world has found that underground disposal of this fuel, around 400 to 600 meters deep in deep geological repositories, or DGRs, is the most effective way to store spent fuel and dispose of it, allowing it to decay out of harm's way for hundreds of thousands of years. Whether that takes the form of tunneling, as you can see here with this picture from Finland, or deep borehole disposal, as you can see with deep isolations research. There are no spent fuel disposal facilities currently operating, but this DGR in Finland is under construction and is scheduled to begin accepting waste for this decade, and it will continue to accept waste for around 100 years. Overall, spent fuel disposal is a thorny political issue worldwide, as can be seen in the US's long-stalled efforts to dispose of spent fuel at Yucca Mountain. And as many countries continue to delay decisions on final spent fuel disposal, the introduction of new types of spent fuel is going to compound the issue of how to manage the pre-existing 400,000 tons. One thing missing from the discussion of emerging reactors is a comparative look at all of these reactors' expected spent fuel outputs. Given the wide range of emerging reactor specifications, they are likely to produce spent fuel amounts that are very different from those of existing reactors. According to my approximations, which are based primarily on design information available in the International Atomic Energy Agency's Advanced Reactors Information System, emerging reactor spent fuel mass per unit of energy output as compared to light water reactors is not likely to exceed light water reactors. There's more variation in volume, and fuel volumes like that of the prismatic block very high temperature reactor could be greater than a light water reactor, due probably to the form itself. But even with smaller outputs, countries choosing to develop these reactors are still facing spent fuel in new, different forms, needing different containers that haven't been determined yet. And understanding the comparative outputs of these reactors should be a consideration as countries move forward, both with final disposal plans and the potential deployment of these reactors. There are also impacts from these reactors on disposal in spent fuel transportation, in additional treatments needed before encapsulation, and considerations of spent fuel interactions with potential DGR host environments. And these challenges indicate that consideration of how to manage reactor outputs should be a key component of the preparation for their deployment to mitigate any sort of exacerbations of the pre-existing spent fuel issue. So earlier I spoke about reprocessing, and I want to note that separated plutonium is considered a direct use material for nuclear weapons. So this proliferation concern, along with cost and other concerns, has led to widespread policy aversion to reprocessing among many states. And in fact, now only 4 states all with nuclear weapons currently operate reprocessing plants to reprocess either their or other states' spent fuel. But several new reactor designs incorporate recycling with some sort of processing technique. And designers point out that unlike conventional reprocessing, here, minor actinides or other waste products could be kept with the fissile material, ensuring that plutonium would be harder to use for weapons. But there remains a lack of clarity about the extent to which plutonium would be separated from this fuel. And with current policy resistance to reprocessing, it's likely going to be difficult to achieve the far-reaching development and deployment that these developers are looking for without a very compelling explanation of why their recycling process is different from conventional reprocessing. In the long term, the focus on recycling in reactors could introduce new variations into the fuel cycle as a whole, but it will likely need some sort of accompanying additional non-proliferation considerations in order to do so. And since we're talking about non-proliferation considerations, I will now turn to one of the other back-end issues that is important to discuss with these reactors, which is that of safeguards. International safeguards, which are conducted by the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, are technical measures intended to verify that material and technologies used for the peaceful use of nuclear energy are not diverted by a country towards non-peaceful use. There is an established system of safeguards based on the type of safeguards agreements concluded between the state and the IAEA, but some of these new designs depart so drastically from the norm that new methods must be devised to supplement existing safeguards approaches. And to that end, developers are encouraged to think about how safeguards features can be incorporated into reactors from the design stage. And this process of safeguards by design needs to be considered as part of ongoing discussions about the ability of the IAEA to verify peaceful use or the safeguardability of these reactors. But there are a number of challenges that these reactors pose to these goals. First, existing fuel is considered an itemized material, meaning that every component can be counted discretely. For example, you see here, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. fuel rods in this assembly. However, this is not possible to use this technique for liquid fuel or hundreds of thousands of triso pebbles moving through a reactor. And so they are considered bulk material. Bulk material conventionally is any sort of large liquid amount, a powder like this yellow cake here, or any other large batch material. And these require bulk material accounting, including adaptation towards reactor use by way of radiation flow monitoring and other statistical methods. In addition, these reactors' coolant materials and high operating temperatures may pose challenges requiring more non-visual monitoring techniques by inspectors. In addition, some reactors may use sealed cores, which means that instead of portions of the core being removed after 18 months or so, instead, the entire core module is removed at the end of its irradiation period. And this is good in that it reduces malicious access to the core, but it also reduces inspector access. In addition, these reactors may pose challenges for inspection capacity related to their back-end activities. For example, the IAEA has noted that fast reactors for breeding may need more intrusive inspections, and increased inspection strains capacity. In addition, the former IAEA Director General Amano noted that from 2010 to 2018, the number of safeguarded facilities around the world grew by around 12%. But the IAEA safeguards budget during that time only grew around 6%. And that was with purely conventional reactors, let alone a new generation of less familiar reactors and fuels. So I've spent a lot of time talking about the challenges, but I want to end by noting that there are plenty of opportunities here as well with the advent of these new reactors. This is a time that the community could address existing and emerging spent fuel management concerns. It is a time to harmonize safeguards approaches, ensuring robust safeguards are continued through this new generation of reactors. It's an opportunity to develop capacity for long-term spent fuel management and inspection and monitoring, as implementation of these things does take time. Finally, this is also an opportunity to build robust proliferation controls into advanced designs. And I'll close by noting that incorporating back-end considerations into the development of emerging reactors is really a way to develop the whole fuel cycle in its entirety. And with that, Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to our discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Rowan. That was a good overview of the paper, and I have a feeling that there's probably quite a few already in the audience who have been able to take a look at it. So also a note to the audience that you can feel free to start adding some Q&A if you would like. But first, I want to turn it over to our two discussants. Andy, over to you first for general thoughts on the paper first and the timeliness of it.
Thanks, India. Well, first of all, thanks to Rowan for kind of taking this initiative and studying this. It's a really important topic at a very important time. So incredibly thorough study, addressing many of the key areas. I think the first thing I'd say, I think that there's definitely been a focus over the last few years on advanced reactors. And everybody's getting very excited where the venture capital money or other money going on into the reactors. But I think it's all been too easy for us to forget that the fuel cycle is likely to introduce as many, if not more, safeguards challenges, I think we could argue, in terms of, from the front end of the fuel cycle or indeed the back end. So I think what Rowan's addressed here and underlining is really an important consideration. It's not just about the reactor, it's the fuel cycle. What I'd like to say, though, just a few opening remarks and just to kind of tee this up a little bit. I think, as we all recognize, I hope that the world is facing clearly a key time in terms of kind of climate change and where this is all going. People would have seen, hopefully, the 60 Minutes recent interview with Bill Gates and also his conversations with the BBC over in the UK, and talking about two key numbers: 51 billion tons of CO2 are emitted every year into the atmosphere, which is an incredible number. And where we really need to be getting to is net zero. So clearly, in order to address that, the only way we can do that is, nuclear needs to be part of. It's not the only solution, but a part of a diverse energy mix. So I think the other thing, just to tee that also up, is that something else that's not just climate change around energy. The other thing is energy security. Now, to other parts of the world, security of energy may mean actual growth or needs of energy. I think from the US, we've seen again this week in Texas, and previously we've seen it in Florida with tornadoes, hurricanes, and so forth, that resilience, energy resilience is incredibly important. And again, therefore, the role that nuclear has in not only a climate agenda, but also an energy security and an energy resilience. So when you start looking at that backdrop and you look at where the rest of the world is moving, you look at China moving to potentially 250 gigawatts of nuclear energy using light water reactors alone. If the US is to convert even just half of its coal stations to nuclear, that will increase the current US fleet to about 150 gigawatts from the current 100. The reason for mentioning that is that will do nothing if only it will do is put pressure on the uranium ore reserves and availability in the world. China alone, with that number, will take about 50% of the world's known uranium reserves. So over that 60-year lifetime of their reactors. So why say all that? Well, what it points to is it's no coincidence that all of these advanced reactors that Rowan very well documented and listed, it's no coincidence that a good part of them are looking at closing the fuel cycle. Better uranium resource utilization, incredibly important if we're to succeed to hit the climate agenda. Secondly, waste is always an issue that continues facing nuclear, and until we address that waste issue, both in terms of interim storage, but ultimately into direct geological disposal, until we address all of those, it's going to be a big challenge for nuclear, both politically and for the public acceptance. So I think really what I just want to underline is nuclear definitely is a path we're all moving towards, like I said, back because of the climate agenda, energy security, energy resilience. Nuclear has a key role in all of that, but clearly that will need better economics, better resource utilization, and better solutions around the waste. And one thing what will certainly happen is that will put a heavier influence on understanding the back end of the fuel cycle, whether for a recycle potential or indeed for minimizing disposal. And there really are some challenges, but as Rowan very well pointed out, there's not just challenges, but there's huge opportunities to address all of those in new technology and a kind of life cycle assessment of all of those. So that's my my introductory comments.
Great, thanks, Andy. Jim, same question to you. General comments on the paper first.
Well, thank you, Cindy. I just have a couple of things to say. One is that I commend Rowan for the paper. I think it is extremely well written and very well researched, and also for her excellent presentation. I think, as Andy has mentioned, it's timely to start considering the issues associated with spent fuel management and safeguards for the emerging reactors. The paper has identified 3 areas of challenges, primary challenges, and has suggested that each of those areas have to be addressed in order to move forward. Now, I think, as Andy had mentioned, challenges are not obstacles. And as Cindy pointed out in her paper, they represent opportunities. So, in my view, early consideration of the ways and means to address these challenges is very worthwhile. Advanced reactors have been discussed for many years in many fora and different aspects, whether they be design, whether it be safeguard approaches or possible safeguard approaches. The discussion has been going on and continues to go on. And what I consider is that Rowan's paper takes this discussion to the next level. So I think that she highlights and puts in a framework the way to take this discussion to the next level of above and beyond what has been done up to this point in time. So thank you very much for the paper, Rowan, and thank you very much for the interesting conversations.
Thank you. I'll do one more questions here to Andy and Jim and then open it up. I see the questions are coming in. Thank you to the participants for those. Andy, in terms of reprocessing and recycling, there's obviously some issues there and issues with the life cycles. Maybe if you could touch upon that a little bit more. Fuel cycles, I mean, sorry.
Yeah, I think one thing that's definitely going to be a big challenge is in relation to the overall supply chain. We look, I mean, Rowan touched on it very well. I mean, you've got a whole set of things around new fuels, new fuel forms, whether it's salts or nuclear grade graphite and so on and so forth. And the ability to develop new processes, both for making the fuel on the front end, but obviously we're talking about the back end here, but also to deal with the back end. That may well be, like we said, talking about reprocessing, or indeed just processes to put the waste in a form that's suitable for ultimate geological disposal. So I think that one of the key challenges being faced really is going to be new infrastructure, new capital investment. Again, not just focusing on the reactors. I think it's all too easy for us to get kind of carried away with the shiny, which is the reactor part of this, without realizing it's the full life cycle. So I think there's substantial investment necessary in the capital side of things for the infrastructure, but also to address some of these challenges that really are opportunities. New safeguards techniques, new safeguards instruments. I think certainly I'm sure we'll touch on this at some point, but the IAEA not only has to work harder, but work smarter, and I think we all need to do that. And I think just one final point on that is that as we move forward, Rowan made a very good point that the light water reactors heavily dominate. So the ones through fuel cycle we know very well, yet it's taken an awful lot of resource to safeguard and manage that infrastructure and that asset. As we go forward with these advanced reactors, one thing's inevitable, and that's diversity. The reactors will diversify, the fuel cycles will diversify, their fuel forms will diversify, and all of that will do is place a greater demand on the agency and other inspectors, not only from a diversity perspective and also the safeguards tech and safeguards inspection regime, but also because of the necessity of a greater amount of knowledge and expertise across a greater number of fuel cycles and a greater number of reactors. So I think that's something we just definitely need to keep an eye on. Things like the fuel forms, the volumes is going to be really challenging, but also I think the understanding of how we're going to resource this going forward.
Thank you. And Jim, safeguards is obviously, as it is diversifying the fuel cycle, obviously there's going to be some challenges on safeguards. Are there any in particular that you'd like to highlight?
Thank you, Cindy. Well, I think Andy has raised a number of points that are relevant to the discussion on safeguards. I mean, advanced reactors themselves present new challenges to safeguards because of their fuel types, their coolants and configurations. And obviously, these kinds of characteristics are also going to be relevant to safeguards at the back end of the fuel cycle in terms of the disposal of the spent fuel. I mean, you can just think amongst some of the things that have to be addressed, you're going to have to be looking at canister development, if that's the way to go, perhaps new encapsulation and disposal strategies and concepts. You're going to be looking at potentially new ways of doing containment and surveillance. I think as mentioned in the presentation, there's also challenges with respect to design information verification, not just for the reactors themselves, but as we would get along to any kind of disposal strategy, be it repositories or even interim storage activities prior to any kind of long-term storage scenario. You know, there are other, Rowan has mentioned that there are some of these reactors may present non-proliferation challenges as well, not just related to safeguards. Let me just say, though, on the safeguard side, I have great faith in the ability of the IAEA and the member states and the experts that work with the IAEA to continue the consideration of how to appropriately safeguard these reactors, how to appropriately safeguard the spent fuel arising from these reactors. I think they have demonstrated up to this point in time that they are able to put in place a very expansive and very appropriate technical approach to safeguarding various fuel types, various reactors. And I have no reason not to believe that we will also find ways of handling some of the challenges that, that Rowan has identified in her paper. On the non-proliferation front, I just think that there's, again, Andy had mentioned and Rowan has mentioned, you know, the issue of some of the reactors and the potential for recycling, which leads us to considerations or potential considerations of what I guess we could say in air quotes may involve some reprocessing of spent fuel. I mean, it's true, reprocessing it does raise a number of policy considerations. It raises a number of policy considerations for suppliers and for exporters. There are restraints in various put in place, whether it be export control restraints or whether it be prior permission restraints, prior consent restraints before these activities can take place. So the point that I noted in Rowan's presentation, the lack of clarity on the degree of the plutonium separation. And I think, you know, if these reprocessing activities take place where you do not have direct access to plutonium, it's probably a better scenario than if some of these strategies involve direct access to separated plutonium. So, thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to, there's a bunch of different questions, which is great. Keep them coming. We do have 24 minutes to be able to answer them. The first one I'm actually going to pick on is one on terminology. So Rowan, there's a question here about the term that the paper doesn't use the term advanced, but refers to them as emerging reactors. And the question is, do you think emerging as a more neutral, objective, and accurate term than advanced?
Thanks, Cindy. Yeah, this is a good question. I do feel that by using the term emerging, I wanted to really show more of a spread of the reactors that are being considered that aren't necessarily a variation on the existing light or pressurized heavy water reactors. And so the emerging reactor label is intended to hone in on these more atypical designs while not being restricted purely to reference designs frequently used by the Generation 4 International Forum in defining their Generation 4 technologies. So the term emerging is intended to kind of catch some of these less commercialized designs while allowing a little bit more flexibility to explore a variety of designs currently under development.
Great, thank you. This question, I think I'll probably open it up to all. The question is, currently IAEA safeguards do not distinguish between LEU and HALEU in terms of safeguards criteria, despite the higher assay. In the physical protection world, insert 225 does distinguish. Should the IAEA create a new safeguards category for HALEU? Any thoughts on that from any of the panelists? Don't all jump in at once. Andy.
I thought Jim was going to jump in on that since it was a safeguards question, but he paused. Safeguards, that level of safeguards isn't my area, but I think it's definitely an emerging area. I think it's going to be a while before those technologies are available and out there as well. I think the other thing that's going to be really quite interesting is that a number of the technologies that are looking at HALEU actually is only looking at HALEU not all of them, but a number of them are looking at HALEU as an interim step to get themselves up and running, so to say, before they move on to the other. So I think it's a really interesting one, is that HALEU could end up being the tail that wags the dog, so to say, because it could end up being like something we all get kind of focused on, and it's only around for a short period of time in that transition to advanced reactors. So I think that's going to be quite an interesting challenge. Jim, you got any thoughts on that?
Thank you. No, Andy, I think it was a deliberate pause there on my part, but I think you filled it in quite well. So I really don't have any. I haven't decided or had given any consideration to whether that is a step that should be taken by the Department of Safeguards.
It's a good one, question to raise, particularly between the different types of guidances out there as well, nuclear security and nuclear safeguards. A question here regarding the different types of fuels, Rowan. In the list of different fuels, you appear to have missed a very important fuel type, metal. The Natrium reactor plans on using metal fuel, and the VTR does as well. Do you believe metal fuel is covered by one of your fuel types, or why not included?
In the paper itself, there is a more exhaustive overview of each of the reactor types that I looked at. That does include the metal fuels as well. So while it wasn't included as an example in the presentation, I can assure you that it is noted in the paper.
Great, thank you. I'm going to skip to a question. I'm going to skip around for those of you who can see the different list of questions coming forward on plutonium processing. The question is, thank you, good day. Thank you for the presentation. My question is on plutonium processing. What is the danger posed today of plutonium, as many nuclear countries have plutonium weapons already? How can we rather use plutonium effectively?
I'll take it. For those people who know me, I used to work for British Nuclear Fuels Limited. So I worked for one of the companies who used to actually do reprocessing, and the UK left themselves with quite a significant, I'm going to use air quotes, zero value asset of 140 tons of separated plutonium. So I think the interesting one here is that a number of countries have separated plutonium. Well, thank goodness it's only a very limited, small number of countries who have that. The number of countries who actually do commercial reprocessing, or indeed in nuclear weapon states, are very limited. But I think one thing that's really interesting, I use that air quote thing again, that zero value asset. The UK government over many years, I spent about 20 years of my career working on this, so it's a topic close to my heart. It's very difficult to put a value on plutonium. And equally, if you look at the optics slightly differently, it becomes a huge liability, not just from a safeguards and security perspective liability, but I mean ultimately disposal and so forth. But as we go forward, and back to the comments I made in my opening remarks, as the world develops potentially nuclear and a greater and greater demand on the existing uranium reserves, something will have to happen really to improve the resource utilization. And I think at that point, the true full value of plutonium becomes, quite significant. That's not to say, though, and I think this is a comment that must be made, that's not to say that every country in the world will be given reprocessing technology. Not every country in the world will be given separated plutonium. Thank goodness. I don't think we should have to say that, but I think it's worth stating just in case there's any doubt. So a very simple example is the UK and France for many years reprocessed fuel from Japan and sent that material back. Neither country sent that material back as separated plutonium. It went back as mixed oxide fuel form. So in other words, it was not separated. It was plutonium now mixed with uranium and therefore was not weaponizable, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a number of kind of complex arguments there. So I think the final point is there is definitely a value in the plutonium, but that's not to say it doesn't come at a cost either. There's still significant safeguards challenges and whatever around that and the security challenges. But we are definitely not, nobody should ever be advocating that every country in the world gets reprocessing or separated plutonium. Absolutely not.
Jim and Rowan, any other comments on that? I think that's a point to end on. There's a question here on whether we have looked at costs for safeguards for these technologies for the whole fuel cycle, fuel fabrication, operation, storage, and disposal. I think I'll just take that one quickly. The answer is no. I haven't seen anything that's done that. We really are at the beginning of looking and studying emerging reactors and the implications for them. And as Rowan's paper has discussed, there's those, of course, on the back end, but there's other products that come out of the back end that we would have to look at as well, and the alternate fuel cycles, of course. And in fact, if I could just do a question that just came into my phone, that will link in a little bit, and it's a question actually about gain, Andy. It's let's see here. Given the need to better understand the back end of the advanced reactor fuel cycle, what is GAIN doing to support learning in this area?
Well, certainly, first of all, for those people who aren't aware of what GAIN is, so GAIN stands for the Gateway for Accelerated Innovation in Nuclear. And the simplest way to look at GAIN is it's a mechanism by which US industry, and I mean everything, I don't just mean the developers or the existing reactor developers, I mean the entire infrastructure and fuel cycle and supply chain. It's where the US industry is able to get access to the might of the capabilities of the national lab complexes, meaning facilities, expertise, legacy documents, and so on and so forth. So that's what GAIN is really all about. So certainly GAIN, we very much respond to what industry needs and wants. So in terms of the awards that have been made in mind of trying to support the US nuclear industry, we've done a number of awards, some primarily around actually even safeguards and security being included. So GAIN does not exclude safeguards and security considerations. But certainly things like legacy documents and some of the historic learning over the years of operating some of these previous advanced reactors or emerging reactors, we would like to say. So things like the operation of EBR2, which is like a natrium kind of basis, or the molten salt reactors and utilizing those. So I think that's where GAIN's made, I would say, inroads into the learning what mistakes were made previously, what good lessons have been learned previously, and sharing that with the US industry. But equally, if the industry has any specific questions that they want addressed and need national lab capability, then absolutely GAIN will respond to that.
Great, thank you. Rowan, maybe you could talk a little bit about the calculations that that are in the paper and why you chose the measurements that you chose, and a little bit more about that, if you could. I see there's some questions about that, but I know there's also background to some of them. So if you could just start explaining the methodology.
Sure. Yeah. So I wanted to look at the comparative outputs of these different types of reactors, both in terms of heavy metal and in overall volume, because they do have very atypical, some of them have very atypical fuel forms and therefore fuel geometry. So for mass, the calculations are largely based on, or excuse me, I should say approximations are largely based on examining the typical burnup for these reactors, power density, or excuse me, thermal efficiency, and a variety of other factors that will determine the relative mass outputs for these reactors compared to existing light water reactors. And this is primarily based on a research methodology from a study by Idaho National Lab, and you can read more about that in Appendix A of the paper. And as for volume, for that I wanted to take the assembly volume in a core because some of these reactors don't have traditional assemblies. For example, the fuel, liquid fuel or spherical pebble doesn't exactly have an assembly structure. But by looking at that unit of volume, we could determine approximate output per year, taking into account the expected unit capacity factor of these plants. And that was also based largely on available design information from the International Atomic Energy Agency's Advanced Reactors Information System, which includes a variety of demonstration and commercial scale designs. And that is in Appendix B. So that was my general methodology for looking at those to determine output approximations. Oh, Cindy, you're muted.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah. Just to note that we welcome comments and feedback to the calculations. We would like to, as there were none in the public literature, of course, Rowan, working with a number of physicists and a chemist, looked at these numbers and came up with these calculations. And we would like to get feedback and bring people together in a closed format to be able to discuss these numbers and take the discussion forward and start the discourse on this and what it will mean for the back end going forward. A question here on, oh, sorry, I just somehow saw it moved. It was a question, there we go. Do the panelists agree that geologic disposal is needed for the disposal of all new designs, since there is always going to be some waste that needs passive disposal?
Yeah, I'm happy to say that. Absolutely, 100%. I mean, there will always be some disposal. I think anybody who believes otherwise just hasn't either understood nuclear or hasn't really looked into the technology. The difference obviously will be the volume. So, for example, if you take spent light water reactor fuel, if you look at the total volume of it, the mass that's of it, 97%, 96% is actually the uranium and plutonium that doesn't really, but that could be recycled and doesn't add a huge amount to the heat or dose implications. So if you can remove that 96%, 97% of the total fuel, you can only dispose of the 3 or 4%, the minor actinides and the fission products, you can really reduce the impact on the repository volume. But you still need the repository, you still need somewhere to put that much smaller volume. The question still remains, though, as to what form that geological disposal will be in. Will it be in the boreholes that is one option that Rowan mentioned, or is it the classic kind of like, you know, dig a tunnel as far down as you can in a big cavern and put it in there, which is much more the classic disposal route, but it would still be needed. That, and again, other countries have done a better job of kind of consulting on that with the consent-based kind of siting for their repositories. Like Finland was mentioned, and Sweden similarly. I think so. I think that the issue, therefore, is that it's always going to be as much. It's less about the technology. It's more about the politics and the local community acceptance.
Jim, if I could put you on the spot, there's a question here that I'm going to tweak a little bit, but it's regarding all the different types of options for disposal. So wondering if you could talk a little bit about multinational geological disposal and some of the elements that you and I touched upon when we were looking at the issue in terms of the legality side of it and the safeguards and export controls that might be at play.
Well, thank you, Sydney. Yes, I mean, there are different types of repositories, and we did have a quick look at the concept of multinational disposal repositories. That would be a situation whereby several countries would agree to dispose of waste in one repository that may be located in one of the countries, but there are many participants in that whole project. So it does, and I do note that there was a recent announcement from Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands about launching the European Repository Development Organization to study common challenges of safely managing low-level radioactive wastes, including establishing shared multinational geological repository. So it's topical. The issues there with any kind of repository, but also a multinational repository, there are issues around obligations on the material that is being placed in the repository. As you know, with nuclear cooperation agreements, that many countries place obligations on material and items that are subject to those agreements. And some of those obligations involve accountancy. Some of them involve prior consents. So there's a whole maze of obligations that could derive from materials that are used in the fuel cycle that therefore continue into the spent fuel and continue into a repository. There are also issues associated with transport. So if say, for instance, 3 or more countries agree to have a multinational geological repository, then under that assumption, there will be transportation of spent fuel or items to be placed in the repository from the other members, from the other partners. So that raises questions associated with transportation, associated with safeguards, and associated with security. And then in the larger, if you went to the next level, you could also envisage that there would be issues associated with just the non-proliferation commitments and undertakings that will be required in order to have countries that have obligated material in the repository, to have them feel satisfied that the non-proliferation obligations are in place and will continue. As you know, these repositories will last for generations. The IAEA may not last for generations, who knows? The NPT may not last for generations. And these are the two mechanisms. One is the NPT being, the body where the most acceptable peaceful use commitment is embodied, legally embodied, and the IAEA being the body in charge with verifying that states are living up to that peaceful use commitment. If either one of those two run into difficulties in the future, what happens to the material that's in the repository? But, when you set up your legal frameworks and your financial frameworks and anything else that may be required to set up a multinational geological repository, you may want to consider including in there things like peaceful use commitments for the duration of the life of the repository. You may want to create your own verification mechanism that could complement the agency's verification mechanism. So there are things that need to be looked at. But again, I think these are just exciting things to think about. These are exciting things to solve. They create a number of challenges, but it's a good opportunity. They present opportunities for people to think creatively about how to address these challenges. And as I said before, I'm pretty certain that creative thinking will take place, and in the end, we'll come out all right. But when you're talking about repositories, you're talking about a long period of time. And So I won't be able to be around to tell you how it all went.
Well, it is a generational commitment by states, whether they come together or do it separately on their own. I'm going to end with two questions for you, Rowan. One is on a particular issue with, and the question is, I did not see any discussion on U-233 as attractive as plutonium and protactin. I'm not going to get it right. Protactinium 233. Which has approximate 27 days half-life decays to U-233. Both present new safeguards challenges to the IAEA. Did you investigate this area as well?
It's also a great question. I did not within the scope of this research. I mean, it's, as with many things, a definite opportunity for future research and discussion as these reactors develop. I did look into some, I guess, mitigation strategies for minor actinide management in terms of looking at other waste products besides just plutonium. So I did explore that element of it, but this would definitely be something to look into further.
There's also one here, and that's also something for us to note for future, and it's actually a question that comes more to Andy, but it's the fuel cycle options study that was performed, does a significant study on advanced fuel cycles. And he's asking for some background on how that study examined safeguards and what their findings were. And then I'm going to end with one.
Yeah, I can very quickly answer that. So that, for anybody who's not seen it, I think it's the paper that Rowan referenced earlier. So it's the evaluation and screening study. It's the most comprehensive study ever undertaken on the planet to do with advanced fuel cycles. And I can say that, my hand on my heart, having spent 20+ years doing the same thing, and then I moved to the labs and we did that study. I was part of that study. So it's called the evaluation and screening study. 26 metrics were considered over a whole range of different fuel cycles, looking at both the benefit of moving to a new fuel cycle, but also the challenge. So there was a challenge and benefits metric was evaluated, which is a really nice way of looking at it. Because the safeguards technology was just impossible to evaluate, the approach for that study was overly simplified, to be honest, because it just wasn't possible to go into the details. And what we looked at was the material attractiveness more so than the safeguardability, which is just one metric. So to answer the question directly, no, we didn't look at the safeguards technology and the safeguards gaps. It looked at the material attractiveness and considered it in that way.
Thank you very much. Actually, I was going to ask you a question, Rowan, more on the methodology, but I think we can get to that separately. We can get back to people and have that discussion. So really to say then, given the time, 2 o'clock right on the dot, that thank you to our panelists and to Rowan for getting the conversation going. And this is a working paper, and so hopefully there will be a working paper too that comes down the line. This is going to be a lot of study on the safeguards aspects, as well as other aspects of non-proliferation, such as export controls going down the line. And the Stimson Center does want to be able to look at these going forward in the years to come. Also, I just wanted to give a shout out to Katie Goodman, who is, when you see her, it's just the Stimson Center as host. She is that white box on your screen, but she is behind the curtain and has been running everything beautifully to be able to ensure that we are able to give this to you and provide this live without issues. This will be put on the website afterwards. So again, thank you to all, to Jim and Andy, and to Rowan for being here today. And of course, check out the video and the paper on the event page. Thank you all. Stay safe and stay warm.
Thanks all.
Thank you.